Hey, welcome back. Pull up a chair. Turn the lights down if you want, though I should warn you that might not be the best idea for what we're doing tonight. And if you've been here before, you already know what this channel is. You know we don't do jump scares, we don't do cheap thrills, and we don't do fiction dressed up as fact. What we do here is dig. We find the stories that slip through the cracks, the ones that got buried under paperwork, or dismissed by people in charge, or just quietly forgotten because no one wanted to deal with what they actually meant. And then we bring them to you, as honestly and as carefully as we can. Tonight's series is called Cargo Train Operators. Now, I want to be upfront with you about where this material comes from, because the sourcing here is a little unusual. Over the past year and a half, I've been collecting accounts, some from online forums, some passed along by people who reached out directly to this channel, and a handful that came from a single individual, a retired freight rail dispatcher out of the Midwest who I'm going to call Raymond throughout this series, because that's the name he asked me to use. Raymond spent 31 years working in and around freight rail. He's seen things. He's heard things. And in his retirement, he's been slowly, carefully sharing them. What you're about to hear is 6 consecutive stories. 6 accounts from people who work or worked the rails. Cargo conductors, engineers, night shift dispatchers, track walkers. People who spend long hours in the dark, in remote places, responsible for hundreds of tons of steel moving through country that most people never see. The stories stand alone, but they're connected. You'll feel it as we go. And look, before we get into this, if this kind of content is what you're after, please take 2 seconds right now and hit that like button. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It genuinely makes a difference in whether we can keep making things like this. We don't run ads mid-story. We don't interrupt you, so that support is everything. All right, let's go. Story 1. The Man at Mile 227. Here's something most people don't know about freight trains. They don't stop easily. A fully loaded intermodal freight train, the kind hauling shipping containers cross-country, can weigh upward of 18,000 tons. At 60 miles per hour, that train needs somewhere between a mile and a mile and a half to come to a complete stop. Even with full emergency braking engaged, even with everything working perfectly, that number matters. Remember it. This story was shared in a private online community for rail workers, a forum that's been around for about 12 years. It's mostly used by conductors and engineers to swap shift stories, ask technical questions, and occasionally vent about management. It's not public. I was given access by a member who's been following this channel for a while and thought I should see it. The original post was made by a user named EngineHouse_K in the early hours of a Thursday morning about 8 months ago. He said he needed to write it down somewhere because he couldn't sleep and his wife was tired of hearing about it. I've edited it slightly for narration, but the core of what he wrote is intact. His name, as far as I know, is Kevin. He works a night freight run in the Pacific Northwest. Kevin had been running the same overnight route for about 4 years when it started. The route goes from a rail yard outside of Portland, Oregon, southeast, through the Cascade foothills, through a stretch of high desert nothing, and terminates at a distribution hub near Ontario, Oregon, right on the Idaho border. The whole run takes between 9 and 10 hours depending on conditions. Kevin usually drove it alone, which is legal on shorter routes, though he'd lobbied his company more than once to put a second conductor on board. Night runs through mountain terrain aren't exactly casual. He knew the route the way you come to know a road you've driven 10,000 times. Every curve, every grade, every mile marker. He could close his eyes and tell you exactly where he was by the sound of the rails. The way the train leaned, the smell coming through the cab window. He'd done it so many times it had stopped being a job and started being something more like a ritual. Mile 227 is in the high desert portion of the run. It's flat country, big sky. On a clear night, you can see the stars the way people in cities have completely forgotten stars can look thick and white and overwhelming. Like someone spilled salt across a black table. There's nothing out there. No roads nearby. No structures. It's just scrub brush and basalt and the occasional coyote if you're lucky. Kevin noticed the figure for the first time on a Tuesday night in late October. He saw it about 30 seconds before he reached it. A shape standing just off the right side of the track, maybe 10 or 15 feet from the rail. At 60 miles per hour, 30 seconds isn't much. He had enough time to register that it was a person, standing very still, facing the train. Then he was past it. He didn't think much of it at first. It happens more than you'd expect. People walk the rails. Hikers sometimes, teenagers. People with nowhere else to go. Technically trespassing, but it's not unheard of. He logged it per protocol and moved on. The following Tuesday, he saw the figure again. Same spot. Mile 227. Same distance from the track. Same posture. Completely still. Facing him. He hit the horn this time, standard practice when there's a person near the rail. The figure didn't move. Reported it again after completing the run. He asked the dispatcher to contact the local county sheriff about a possible trespasser. The dispatcher said they'd make the call. Kevin assumed that would be the end of it. But the Tuesday after that, the figure was there again. Now he was paying attention. He started watching for it every run, not just Tuesdays. Monday nights, Wednesday nights, every night that week. Nothing. Mile 227 was empty. But the following Tuesday, like clockwork, the figure was back, standing in exactly the same place, exactly the same posture. Kevin started timing it. He'd note the exact moment he spotted the figure and the exact moment he passed it. The numbers were almost identical every time. 31 seconds of visibility, give or take a second. The figure was always the same distance from the track, always facing him. He tried to get a better look. Started switching on the cab's exterior spotlight a few seconds before mile 227 on Tuesday nights. What he saw didn't make him feel better. It was a man. He was confident of that. Adult male, he guessed. Average height. Wearing what looked like dark work clothes, maybe a jacket of some kind. But the face. Kevin couldn't make out the face. Not because of distance. The spotlight was strong enough. Just couldn't seem to bring the face into focus, the way you sometimes can't read a sign in a dream even though you know the letters are right there. He told his wife. He told a coworker. He told his dispatcher again. Everyone had an explanation. Squatter in the area. Local eccentric. Maybe it was a different person each time and he was pattern matching. The brain does that. The brain loves a pattern. Kevin heard all of it. He nodded. And then on the next Tuesday, he asked his supervisor if he could take a relief conductor out with him. Told him he'd been having some trouble with the approach to mile 224. Wanted a second set of eyes on a few things? That was a lie. But it got him what he needed. His relief conductor that night was a guy named Dominic. 12 years on the rails, skeptical about basically everything. Kevin didn't tell him about the figure in advance. He didn't want to prime him. He just asked Dominic to watch the right side of the track as they came through the desert stretch. At mile 227, Kevin turned on the spotlight. Dominic didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Who is that?" Kevin felt something cold move through him. Not quite fear, but the thing that lives right next to it. "You see him too?" he said. Dominic said he did. Standing there. Dark jacket. Facing them, they blew past at 60. Kevin hit the horn twice. The figure didn't react. Kevin filed a formal incident report that night. The railroad company notified the county. Deputy drove out 2 227 2 days later and reported nothing unusual. No signs of camping, no footprints, nothing. The ground out there is hard-packed volcanic soil. Doesn't hold prints well, the deputy noted. Nothing to follow up on. The following Tuesday, Kevin drove the route alone. He turned on the spotlight at mile 225, giving himself more lead time. He watched the desert roll by. The spotlight swept over scrub and rock and the flat nothing of the high desert. At mile 227, there was no one there. He let out a breath, told himself it was over. told himself the reports had scared someone off, or that it had been a coincidence all along, or that maybe Dominic had just been going along with what he expected to see. The brain does that. He was through a mile 228. Mile 229. Then his radio crackled. The dispatcher's voice came through, and she sounded strange, not panicked, but careful. The way people sound when they're choosing words deliberately. She told him to reduce speed and prepare to stop. She told him there was a report of a person on the tracks ahead. Mile 231. Kevin brought the train down. At mile 231, standing directly on the tracks, facing him, was the figure. He stopped the train. It took him the better part of a mile and a half to do it. By the time he reached mile 231, there was no one there. He never ran that route again. He requested a transfer 3 days later and got it within the week. Somebody at the company owed him a favor. He didn't tell them the real reason. He just asked to be moved to a daytime route, shorter haul, closer to Portland. In his forum post, Kevin ended with this: "I've thought about it a lot. The thing that bothers me most isn't what I saw. It's the Tuesday thing. It was always on a Tuesday. I don't know what happened on a Tuesday out there in that desert. I don't know if I want to, and honestly neither do I. If that one got under your skin, stay with me because we're just getting started. And hey, real quick, if you're finding value in this series already, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. We've got 5 more of these and we're not slowing down." Story 2. Dead Freight. Here's a fact that most people outside of the freight industry don't think about. Nobody checks everything. A large intermodal freight train can carry anywhere from 100 to over 300 shipping containers. Each container is sealed. Each has a manifest, a document describing what's inside. But the manifest is trusted, not verified. Customs checks a fraction of them. Railroad staff checked essentially none. From the moment those containers are sealed at their point of origin to the moment they're opened at their destination, they are a black box. That's by design. It's efficient. It usually works fine. Usually. This account was sent to me directly via email by a woman I'll call Sandra. She didn't want her last name used. She didn't want her employer named. Said she'd found this channel through a friend, had been watching for a few months, and had finally decided that she wanted someone to know what she and her crew experienced. Even if that someone was just me and whoever was watching. Sandra has worked as a freight conductor for 9 years. It's happened in her 4th year on the job. During a cross-country run that originated on the West Coast and was bound for a distribution hub in Tennessee, she was part of a 2-person crew. The other conductor, her partner that run, I'll call Marcus. The run had been normal for the first 12 hours. They were somewhere in New Mexico when Marcus noticed it. Sandra was in the small rest compartment at the back of the cab, trying to get a couple of hours of sleep before her next driving shift. Marcus woke her up not by calling her name, but by knocking on the wall between them, their agreed signal for something's off. Come up front. Not an emergency knock. Not the fast, hard knock that meant stop everything. The slow, deliberate one that meant when you can, come see this. She came up front. Marcus was staring at the instrument panel, specifically at the load distribution readout. Modern freight locomotives monitor weight distribution across the train. It's a safety system. Helps detect shifted cargo or unstable loads. Something in the train's midsection had shifted. Not catastrophically. Not in a way that required emergency action. Just enough to register. The readout showed a weight anomaly in cars 41 through 43, a cluster of containers near the middle of the consist. The overall load was still balanced enough to run safely, but the anomaly was there, and it was Marcus used the word rhythmic. The weight shift was rhythmic. Sandra asked him what he meant. He pulled up the readout history on the screen and showed her. The anomaly had started about 40 minutes earlier and had been repeating on a rough cycle of every 4 to 5 minutes. A small shift, not dramatic, but consistent. Something in those containers was moving. Now, things shift in containers. It happens. It's improperly secured cargo, items that weren't braced well enough, a settling that occurs naturally over miles of travel. It's inconvenient, occasionally dangerous if it's bad enough, but it's not unusual. The protocol is to note it and report it, and if it worsens, to stop and inspect. What made Marcus knock on the wall wasn't the shifting itself. It was that it was rhythmic. Cargo that's shifted doesn't move rhythmically. It shifts, and then it either stays shifted or continues shifting in one direction. It doesn't pulse. It doesn't repeat. The only things that move rhythmically are things that are alive. Sandra told him it was probably a structural thing. Resonance from the rails, some kind of mechanical feedback. Marcus said maybe. They watched the readout for another 20 minutes. It kept pulsing, every 4 to 5 minutes, small but consistent. They reported it to their dispatcher, who contacted the originating freight company. The company confirmed that cars 41 through 43 were carrying sealed steel containers with manifested loads of industrial textile, equipment, bolts of fabric, automated looms, machine parts, heavy and organic, absolutely not capable of moving rhythmically. The company suggested the readout was a sensor glitch and dispatched a maintenance check at their next scheduled stop, about 3 hours away. Sandra and Marcus kept driving. The anomaly kept pulsing. About an hour before their next stop, the readout changed. Instead of the 4 to 5 minute cycle, it became faster, more irregular. The weight shifts were smaller but more frequent, and they were no longer confined to cars 41 through 43. They were spreading. Car 44, car 34, car 39, Marcus said, very quietly. Sandra, I think something is trying to get out. She wanted to dismiss it. She really did. She told him he'd been on shift too long, that he was tired, that the sensor was malfunctioning. She said all of the reasonable things. But she also found herself not wanting to walk back through the connector to the rear of the train. And she couldn't quite explain why. They made their stop. It was a mid-sized freight yard, the kind with a skeleton night crew and a lot of dark space between the floodlights. A maintenance tech came aboard to check the sensors. He was a young guy, couldn't have been more than 25. And he did his job efficiently and without any apparent concern. He came back 20 minutes later and told them the sensors were functioning normally. No malfunction detected. He suggested the anomaly had resolved itself. He handed them a clipboard with a form to sign. They signed it, and he walked away. Before he left earshot, Sandra asked him if anyone had checked the containers. He turned around and looked at her for a moment, then said that opening sealed containers wasn't part of his job. She'd need to contact the freight company if she wanted an inspection. She asked the dispatcher. The dispatcher contacted the freight company. The freight company said there was no cause for inspection, based on a sensor anomaly that had resolved. They said the cargo was secure, and the manifest was accurate. They said the train should continue. Marcus looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at Marcus. They continued. The anomaly didn't come back. The rest of the run was smooth. They handed off in Tennessee 20-some hours later to a local crew for the final leg to the distribution hub. That would be the end of the story except for one thing. 3 weeks later, Sandra got a call from a railroad company compliance officer. He asked her about the run, about the anomaly she'd logged. She answered his questions. Then she asked him why he was calling. He paused for what she described as an uncomfortably long time. He told her that when the containers in cars 41 through 43 were opened at the distribution hub, the receiving crew had found the cargo displaced. The textile equipment was there, all of it, accounted for. But it had been moved. Not shifted the way cargo shifts in transit. Moved deliberately, stacked differently than it had been loaded. Some items were arranged in a rough circle in the center of the container floor. The compliance officer asked her if she'd had any unauthorized stops or unexplained access to those cars during the run. She said no. He thanked her, said it was probably a loading error, said he'd noted in the file. She asked him if there had been anything else in the containers. Another long pause. He said the investigation was ongoing, and then he ended the call. Cassandra told me she never heard from him again. She also told me that she requested a copy of the incident file 6 months later through the company's internal documentation process. The file had been closed. The reason listed was cargo discrepancy resolved, no further action required. She doesn't know what was in those containers. She says she's made peace with not knowing. I'm not sure I believe her. Hold on to that one. 2 stories in, and I want to check in with you if you're listening late at night. Maybe with headphones in and the house is quiet, you're exactly the audience these stories were built for. Appreciate you being here. Hit that like button if you haven't, and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this series. We've got 4 more. Story 3. The 11 Minutes. On December 28, 1994, an Amtrak passenger train called the Sunset Limited derailed near Huxford, Alabama, after a barge struck a railroad bridge in thick fog. 47 people died. Remains one of the deadliest rail disasters in American history. What most people don't know is that in the minutes before the derailment, the train's engineer reported to dispatch that he'd been experiencing intermittent instrument failures and unexplained signal drops for the better part of an hour. Those reports were logged. They were also ignored. I'm not telling you that to be grim. I'm telling you that because it provides context for why some engineers, when their instruments start behaving strangely, don't report it right away. They wait. They watch. They try to understand what they're seeing before they put it on the official record. Because once it's on the record, it follows you. This story comes from Raymond, the retired dispatcher I mentioned at the start of tonight. He's given me a handful of accounts over the past several months, and most of them I've been saving. This one, he specifically asked me to share because it involves a man he knew personally, a man he calls Patrick. Patrick ran freight for 22 years in the upper Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Dakotas. He died in 2019 of a heart attack in his home. He was 61 years old. Raymond says he was a good man, a careful engineer, and completely sane. He says that in the last 5 years of Patrick's life, Patrick told this story to Raymond at least a dozen times, not because he was obsessed with it, but because he needed someone to confirm over and over again that it had really happened. He hadn't imagined it. Raymond says he always confirmed it, because Patrick wasn't the only one who had the record. The night in question was a February run. Sometime in the mid-2000s, Raymond is vague about the exact year, and I'm going to respect that. Patrick was running a northbound freight through central Minnesota, a relatively routine overnight haul. Grain hoppers mostly, a clear night. Cold, the way Minnesota in February is cold, the kind of cold that makes the rails sing. At 2:14 in the morning, the locomotive's GPS and telemetry system went dark. Just gone. No warning. No fault code. The screen went black, the position read out, zeroed out, and the communication link to dispatch flatlined. Patrick immediately tried to reach dispatch by radio. Nothing. Static. He checked his backup radio. Same thing. He checked the locomotive's onboard fault system. It showed no errors. Everything was technically functioning. The GPS was gone. The telemetry was gone, and he couldn't reach anyone. He slowed the train and ran through his protocols. He was on a long straight stretch of track. No crossings nearby that he knew of, no towns immediately adjacent. He had his physical map, his watch, and his own sense of position from years of running this route. Estimated his location, marked his speed, and began to carefully continue forward while working to restore communication. At 2:25 in the morning, everything came back. GPS online, telemetry restored, radio connected. The dispatcher's voice came through almost immediately. She sounded tightly controlled, the kind of voice that's working hard not to sound alarmed. She asked Patrick to confirm his position. He gave his position. There was a pause. Then she asked him to confirm again. He did another pause. Then she said, "Patrick, we need you to stop the train and wait for a field inspection crew." He stopped. He waited. The inspection crew arrived in about 45 minutes. Two guys in a truck who walked the locomotive and the first several cars. Checked the wheels, checked the undercarriage, looked at the track behind the train. They didn't find anything wrong. What they did find, and this is the part that Raymond always gets quiet when he tells it, was a discrepancy in the position data. When the telemetry went dark at 2:14, the GPS had logged Patrick's position as marker 318.7 on the route. When it came back online at 2:25, it logged his position as marker 318.9. 11 minutes had passed. At the speed Patrick had been traveling before slowing down, he should have covered approximately 8 to 10 miles. He had covered approximately 0.2 miles. The math doesn't work. It doesn't work for a train that was moving. It doesn't work for a train that was stopped. If Patrick had hit the brakes the instant the telemetry went dark and sat still for 11 minutes, he still should have been closer to where the telemetry said he'd started. The inspection crew noted the discrepancy. They filed it under sensor error. They told Patrick his equipment would be checked at the next scheduled maintenance window. They drove away. Patrick sat in the cab for a while before he continued the run. He told Raymond he didn't feel like himself for those first few miles after. Not sick, not frightened, just slightly off. The way you feel when you wake up in an unfamiliar room and spend a disoriented moment not knowing where you are. The feeling passed after about 30 minutes. He completed the run without further incident. But there are two other details that Raymond told me, things that Patrick always included when he told the story. The first, the cargo. When the train was offloaded at its destination the next morning, the grain hopper crew noticed that several of the hoppers had less grain than their load manifest indicated. Not significantly less, but enough to measure. The discrepancy was attributed to moisture loss and settling during transit, a common enough explanation. It was logged. It was closed. The second, Patrick's watch. Patrick wore an automatic mechanical watch, an old one, his father's, not connected to GPS or any digital system, purely mechanical. When he stopped the train and compared his watch to the locomotive's onboard clock after the telemetry was restored, the two were out of sync. His mechanical watch showed 2:19 when the locomotive clock showed 2:25. 6 minutes, unaccounted for. Even by his own watch. Raymond says Patrick eventually stopped wearing that watch. Not because it stopped working, it kept perfect time. Just didn't like what it implied. I don't have a clean explanation for what happened to Patrick that night. I don't think Raymond does either. What I know is that the dispatch records showing the telemetry gap are real. Raymond has seen them, and that the position discrepancy was real, was logged, and was never credibly explained. 11 minutes, 12 miles of nothing, and a mechanical watch that disagreed with the clock on the wall. That one's going to sit with me for a while. We're halfway through tonight's series. 3 more stories left. Now, don't go anywhere. And if you're sharing this with someone, now's a great time to send it to them. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. It keeps this work alive. Story 4. The Brakeman. Here's something historians of American railroading know, but most people don't. The brakeman was once one of the most dangerous jobs in the country. Before automatic air brakes were introduced in the late 1800s, freight trains were stopped manually. A crew of brakemen would ride on top of the cars on the roofs, and when the engineer whistled the stop signal, they'd run across the tops of moving cars and twist the handbrakes on each one, car by car, in sequence, while the train was still moving, in winter, in rain, in the dark. The death toll was extraordinary. Tens of thousands of brakemen died on the job between the end of the Civil War and the widespread adoption of air brakes in the 1890s, falling between cars, falling off roofs, getting crushed by slack action, losing hands, arms, legs at the couplings. There are entire cemeteries in rail towns across the Midwest and South where most of the headstones belong to young men who worked the cars. They are, as a demographic, arguably the most comprehensively killed group of workers in American industrial history. According to at least a handful of people who work the rails today, some of them haven't entirely stopped working. This account was posted to the same freight worker forum where we found Kevin's story. The post was made about 14 months ago by a user named trackdog_Lewis. Lewis has been on the forum for years, has over 1,000 posts, and is considered a reliable and no-nonsense contributor by the regulars there. This is, by all accounts, out of character for him, which is part of why it's stuck around. Lewis runs freight in the Deep South. He's mentioned Alabama and Mississippi in other posts, so I'll put it somewhere in that region. He's been doing it for 18 years, married a few kids. A guy who, by his own description, takes his lunch seriously and doesn't much care for mystery or ambiguity. He posted the account at around midnight on a weeknight. He said he'd been debating whether to post it for 3 months, and finally decided that if he didn't write it down somewhere outside his own head, it was going to drive him crazy. The run in question was an overnight freight, southbound in the dead of summer, high humidity. The kind of southern night where the air feels thick and alive, where the bugs are loud even from inside a sealed cab, where the darkness between the trees on either side of the track is absolute. Lewis was about 6 hours into the run, coming through a stretch of old rail corridor. He described it as one of the older sections of track in the region. Late in the early 20th century, passing through countryside that hadn't changed much since. Farmland, pine forest, few small towns with their lights off at that hour. He was alone in the cab, looked out the forward windshield and saw someone on top of the train. He actually had to process this for a second. He looked at the image, decided it didn't make sense, and looked again. But it was there. A figure. Standing on top of one of the freight cars behind the locomotive, maybe 3 cars back, standing upright. Not crouching, not moving, just standing, with the wind and the dark all around him. As if standing on a moving freight train in the middle of the night was a completely ordinary thing to do. Lewis's first thought, and it's a reasonable one, was that someone had jumped the train. Train hopping is illegal, but it happens. Sometimes people climb aboard at a slow section of track and ride for miles. It's dangerous. It's incredibly stupid. But people do it. He immediately got on the radio and reported a possible trespasser on the consist. He began slowing the train. He hit the exterior lights. The figure didn't react to the lights, didn't move, didn't crouch down or try to hide, just stood there. Lewis got the train down to about 15 miles per hour, not stopped, but slow enough to be manageable, and craned his neck to look back through the side window. The figure was still there. He could see it more clearly now with the lights on it. It was a man. Old work clothes, dark pants, suspenders over a light shirt, a flat-brimmed hat that Lewis associated with early to mid-20th century working men. The man was looking forward toward the locomotive toward Lewis with an expression that Lewis couldn't quite read. Lewis got on the radio again. He told dispatch he was stopping to remove a trespasser. Dispatch acknowledged. He brought the train to a full stop on a straight stretch of track, took his flashlight, went through the connector, and climbed out. He walked back along the side of the train, shining the light up at the tops of the cars. There was nobody there. He walked the full length of the accessible cars. He shone the light under the chassis, checked the platforms at the car ends. "Nobody," he called out. No response. He reported to dispatch that he'd found nothing. Dispatch noted the stop in the log. He climbed back aboard and continued the run. He didn't tell anyone about the clothes. He almost left that part out of the forum post too, he said, because the clothes were the part that didn't fit any rational explanation. Modern trespassers don't wear suspenders and flat-brimmed work hats. He ended his post with a detail that I find quietly devastating. Said he'd gone home after the run, hadn't been able to sleep, and eventually found himself at his kitchen table at 4 a.m., looking things up on his phone. He typed in the name of the rail corridor he'd been on. He found a local historical society page. The corridor had been built in 1903. It had been worked in its early decades by a large crew of brakemen. The historical society page had photographs. in work clothes, suspenders, flat-brimmed hats. Lewis said he closed the tab and sat in his kitchen until his kids woke up for school. He's never posted about it again. I checked. For down, 2 to go. Stay with me. We're in the home stretch of this thing. Like the video if you haven't, it truly helps. And let's keep going. Story 5. Switch point. Train switches, or points, if you're in the UK, are the mechanisms that allow a train to be directed from one track to another. They're controlled electrically, remotely, by dispatchers, and they're designed with multiple redundancies. They are, by engineering standard, extremely difficult to accidentally misalign. They are also the cause of roughly a third of all significant rail incidents when they fail. A misaligned switch can send a train onto the wrong track. In a busy rail corridor, a wrong track can mean a head-on collision. In a yard, it can mean a derailment. The consequences are fast and they are large, which is why the dispatcher's job, specifically the management of switch points during a complex night operation, is considered one of the most demanding cognitive tasks in the transportation industry. Dispatchers are tracking multiple trains simultaneously, managing switch states across hundreds of miles of track, communicating with crew, responding to changes in real time, and they do it very often alone. In a room, in the middle of the night, this story is Raymond's own. He told it to me over the course of 2 phone calls. He's a careful, methodical man, not given to embellishment. He'd spent 31 years in dispatch before he retired. And in those 31 years, he said, this was the only incident he never filed a complete report on. Not because he was hiding it, but because he couldn't figure out how to describe what happened in language that dispatch protocol actually had a category for. Raymond was running the overnight board at a mid-sized dispatch center in the upper Midwest. I'm not going to name the state or the company. He was specific about that. He was in his early 40s at the time, 20-odd years into his career, experienced enough that the night shift had stopped being stressful in any ongoing way. He'd developed the kind of calm that comes from having handled so many emergencies that emergencies themselves had become, if not routine, then at least known quantities. It was a quiet night. 3 active trains in his sector, all running on time, all on main lines. Low traffic. He was monitoring his board, sipping coffee, doing the kind of low-level maintenance work that fills the hours when nothing is actively demanding attention. At 1:47 a.m., switch point 14 Charlie changed state. 14 Charlie was a switch at a junction about 60 miles from the dispatch center. It was currently inactive, no train approaching it, no train scheduled for it for another 4 hours. The switch had been sitting in its default position all night. Then it moved. His board showed it going from normal to reverse and back to normal in the span of about 8 seconds. Raymond ran a diagnostic. The switch reported normal. No fault. No mechanical issue detected. No power spike in the local system. Flagged it as a potential sensor glitch and kept watching. At 1:52 a.m. it did it again, and this time 14 Delta, the adjacent switch, about a quarter mile down the junction, changed with it. Both switches going reverse and back in sequence a few seconds apart. Raymond picked up his phone and called the local maintenance line. Got the overnight maintenance tech, a man he'd worked with for years, reliable, no nonsense. He asked him to run a check on switches 14 Charlie and 14 Delta. The tech said he'd pull the data. While Raymond was waiting, the switches moved again. This time they held in reverse for nearly 30 seconds before returning to normal. The maintenance tech called back, said the switches were physically fine. He said the motor drive showed no irregularity. He said the movement logs were showing the changes. The sensors were reading something, but there was no command in the system that explained them. Nobody had sent a switch command. The automation had no reason to move them. They hadn't moved on their own in any way the tech could identify. Raymond asked if it was possible someone was at the junction physically, moving the switches manually. Manual override is possible at any switch point. It requires a specific tool and deliberate effort, but it can be done. The tech said he'd check. In the meantime, Raymond kept watching his board. The switches settled. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Then at 2:31 a.m., every switch in the 14 series, 14 of them, the entire junction complex moved simultaneously to reverse. Raymond sat up very straight. 14 switches moving at once was not a sensor glitch. 14 switches moving at once, in perfect synchronization, with no command issued and no train approaching, was a system-level event of a kind Raymond had never seen in 20-odd years of dispatching. He got on the radio immediately, raised all 3 active train crews, told them to hold position and confirm their locations. He called his supervisor at home, called the maintenance centers, senior tech. The switches returned to normal position after 43 seconds. The maintenance tech arrived at the junction physically about 20 minutes later. He walked the entire switch complex with a flashlight. He found nothing. No person, no vehicle, no equipment malfunction he could identify. Every switch was in normal position and registered normal on all diagnostics. Raymond's supervisor arrived at the dispatch center around 3:30. He reviewed the logs with Raymond. The logs clearly showed the switch movements. They clearly showed no command input. He made some calls, brought in a senior systems engineer the next day. The engineer's conclusion, filed in a report that Raymond says he read 3 times and found completely unsatisfying, was that the events were caused by a cascading sensor fault that had since resolved itself. The report recommended a full diagnostic inspection of the 14 series switch electronics within the next 60 days. The inspection happened. Nothing was found. What Raymond told me in the second phone call was the part he'd never put in any report. While he was waiting, that 43 seconds when all 14 switches were in reverse, which was, for a freight dispatcher, effectively 43 seconds when his entire junction was set to direct any incoming train to the wrong track, he felt something. In the dispatch room with him. He doesn't use the word presence. He said he's not the kind of man who uses that word. Said it felt more like attention, like something had turned its attention toward him. It's like something was watching the board the same way he was watching it. It's with the same professional interest, the same focused operational awareness. He said it lasted for about 30 seconds. And then the switches returned to normal and the feeling was gone. I asked him what he thought it was. He was quiet for a while. He said, I think maybe something wanted to see if I was paying attention. I asked him if he thought he'd passed the test. He said, we're still here, aren't we? Raymond doesn't talk about that night very often. He's talked about it with me more than he's talked about it with anyone, I think. I'm grateful he did. One story left, and it's the one Raymond specifically told me to save for last. Story 6. Last run. The average career length of an American freight train engineer is somewhere between 25 and 35 years. These are people who spend enormous portions of their lives in the cab of a locomotive, in the dark, alone, covering distances that most people only travel by air. They develop a relationship with their routes the way sailors develop a relationship with water, intimate, specific, and not entirely rational. When they retire, they don't always retire cleanly. There's a term that circulates in rail culture, not official, not in any manual, for the phenomenon of engineers who, after decades on the same route, start showing up to do their old run anyway just to drive it one more time. Some of them ask permission, some of them don't. The ones who don't are gently removed. It happens more than the railroads like to admit. The pull apparently is very strong. This final story is about a man Raymond knew for over 20 years. He'll call him Wallace. I'll call him Wallace too. Wallace ran freight in the Appalachian region, the old mountain routes through West Virginia, Kentucky, eastern Tennessee, some of the most beautiful and most demanding rail terrain in North America. Steep grades, Tight curves, mountain tunnels cut through solid rock in the 1800s that are still in daily use, routes that require an engineer to be genuinely skilled, not just experienced. Wallace was, by Raymond's account, one of the finest engineers he ever worked with. Careful, intuitive, the kind of man who understood the machinery in his bones. Wallace retired at 67 after 40 years on the rails. A good, long career. A party at the yard, a plaque, a handshake from the regional director. 8 weeks later, he was back. Raymond got the call at 11 p.m. on a Thursday. The caller was a yard supervisor at the West Virginia facility, where Wallace had worked his last decade. The supervisor sounded confused more than alarmed. He said there was a locomotive on the line that shouldn't be there. More specifically, a locomotive had left the yard approximately 2 hours earlier on Wallace's old route. The night dispatcher had logged it departing, assumed it was an authorized deadhead move, a locomotive moving without cargo, and hadn't questioned it until a downstream. Crew noticed the locomotive passing a checkpoint where no locomotive was scheduled. The locomotive was authorized to be in the yard. It was not authorized to be moving. Raymond helped coordinate the response. He tracked the locomotive via its onboard GPS. It was moving at a legal, careful speed. Not running reckless. Not in distress. Just driving. On Wallace's old route, northbound through the mountain corridor, they tried to reach the cab by radio. No response. The radio was on, they could see it was active, but no one answered. They contacted Wallace directly, called his home number. His daughter answered. She said her father was home. He'd been home all evening, she said. He was in his chair in the living room and had been there since dinner. Raymond told me he had a strange feeling at that point. A feeling like two separate, impossible things were pressing against each other. He said he didn't know what to do with it, so he just kept doing his job. They sent a crew in a truck to intercept the locomotive at a crossing point about 40 minutes ahead. 2 men with the authority and the equipment to board and stop the locomotive if necessary. The locomotive reached the crossing. It slowed, as if it knew the stop was coming. The crew boarded. The cab was empty. The locomotive was running. Controls were in an active drive configuration. The throttle was set to a specific position. The cab light was on. Coffee thermos all beat up. The kind a man carries for decades sat in the cup holder beside the engineer's seat. No one was in the cab. The crew secured the locomotive. They brought it back to the yard. The coffee thermos was collected as part of the investigation. It took about a week for someone to think to check whether it matched any equipment logged out to Wallace over his career. It did. The thermos had Wallace's employee number engraved on a piece of tape on the bottom. The old way guys used to mark their things in the days before everything was digital. It had been logged as returned to inventory when Wallace cleared out his locker on his last day. It should not have been in that cab. Wallace, when contacted by company investigators, said he had no explanation. He said he hadn't been in the yard. Said the thermos had been in a box in his garage since he cleaned out his locker. He invited the investigators to come look. They went to his house. The box was in the garage, right where he said. The thermos was not in the box. Wallace died 14 months after his retirement. His daughter told Raymond at the funeral that her father had spent most of those 14 months restless. He'd struggled to fill the days. That he'd often talked about the mountain route in the way someone talks about a person they miss. That in the last few weeks of his life, he'd seemed more at peace, and that she couldn't explain why. Raymond went to the funeral. He stood at the graveside in the cold November air with a small group of people who'd worked with Wallace for decades. And afterward, when everyone was gathered at the family home, he found himself talking to a young engineer who'd run the same mountain route in the past few years. The young engineer mentioned, almost in passing, that there had been some strange instrument readings on the route lately. GPS anomalies. Readouts that didn't quite track. His supervisor had attributed it to the mountain terrain interference from the ridgelines. Raymond asked if it had started recently. The young man thought about it. He said, Yeah, actually. Past few months, maybe a year. Raymond did the math in his head. Said he thanked the young man, got his coat, and went home. He told me he doesn't know what Wallace's attachment to that route was made of. He doesn't know if what he moved through those mountains after retirement was the man himself, or some residue of 40 years of devotion, or something that the mountains and the rails and the dark had quietly made out of all those hours Wallace had given them. What he knows is that the mountain route is still running, that whoever's driving it in the cab, there might be someone else who considers it home. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. 6 stories.
Ow.
6 people who went out into the dark, into the long straight lines of track through the desert and the mountain and the plain, and came back with something they couldn't quite put down. I want to thank Raymond, wherever he is tonight, for trusting me with his material. I want to thank Sandra and Kevin and Lewis and everyone else who's reached out to this channel with something they needed someone to hear. This is why we're here. If this series connected with you, if you found yourself in the right headspace for it, or if it made the night feel a little more alive than it did before, then this channel is your place. We do this regularly.
Owie.
We go looking in the corners that don't get enough light. Please take a second and hit like on this video. It costs you nothing, and it genuinely matters for how this content gets seen. And subscribe. There's more coming. Stories from night shift nurses, from long-haul truckers, from lighthouse keepers and oil rig workers and park rangers in the deep backcountry. We barely started. Stay safe out there. And if you ever work a night shift, keep your eyes on the track.